Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the channel. Introduction: The War That Changed America. Forever, World War I, often called the Great War, was one of the most devastating conflicts in human history. From 1914 to 1918, the world witnessed an unprecedented level of destruction, reshaping nations and redefining global power structures. Though the war was fought primarily in Europe, its effects rippled across the Atlantic, transforming the United States in ways that still impact us today. At the start of the war, America was a largely isolated nation, hesitant to get involved in European conflicts. However, by 1917, the U.S. joined the war effort, a decision that would mark the beginning of its rise as a global superpower. But beyond military victories, World War I brought immense change to America's social, political, and economic fabric. It was a turning point that reshaped the nation's identity, economy, and role on the world stage. In this video, we will dive deep into the profound ways World War I shaped modern America. We'll explore how the war fueled economic expansion, ignited social movements, and redefined civil rights. We'll see how it reshaped the U.S. government, led to sweeping reforms, and set the stage for America's leadership in the 20th century. From women's suffrage to the Red Scare, from economic booms to cultural shifts, the impact of World War I on America was massive, and it still echoes in our society today. By the end of this video, you'll see how this conflict was not just a distant European war, but a catalyst that transformed the United States into the modern nation we know today. Let's begin. America. Before the war, a nation on the sidelines. Before World War I, the United States followed a foreign policy rooted in isolationism, the belief that America should avoid entangling itself in European conflicts. This stance had been reinforced by President George Washington's farewell address in 1796, which warned against permanent foreign alliances, and was later solidified by the Monroe Doctrine, 1823, which focused on keeping European powers out of the Western Hemisphere. By the early 20th century, America was a rising industrial power, but it was still hesitant to involve itself in global affairs. President Woodrow Wilson, elected in 1912, reflected this cautious approach. He even campaigned for re-election in 1916 with the slogan, "He kept us out of war." The general sentiment among Americans was that Europe's problems should remain in Europe. Many saw World War I as just another conflict between imperial powers, one that had little to do with the United States. However, isolationism didn't mean the U.S. was completely detached from the world. American businesses were deeply invested in global trade, particularly with Britain and France. While the government officially remained neutral, private companies and banks were supplying weapons, food, and other goods to the Allies, making the U.S. economically tied to the war long before it entered. An expanding economy, but not yet a wartime machine, America in the early 20th century was undergoing rapid industrialization. The Second Industrial Revolution had transformed the nation, with factories, railroads, and urban centers growing at an unprecedented rate. However, before World War I, the U.S. economy was not yet fully mobilized for war. Heavy industry, such as steel, coal, and railroads, was booming, but it was geared toward peacetime production rather than military supply chains. Despite its economic strength, the U.S. was not considered a military powerhouse. The U.S. Army, in 1914, had only about 100,000 active-duty soldiers, a tiny force compared to the millions mobilized by European powers. The country had no tradition of maintaining a large standing army, as many Americans feared that a powerful military could lead to unnecessary foreign wars or even domestic tyranny. Most Americans saw their nation as a land of economic opportunity, rather than a global enforcer. This mindset would change dramatically once the U.S. entered the war, when factories would transition to producing guns, ammunition, ships, and airplanes at an astonishing pace, turning the nation into an industrial war machine. A society divided by race, gender, and class before World War I, America was far from united. The country was deeply divided along racial, gender, and class lines, tensions that would later be magnified by the war. Race and segregation. The early 20th century was the height of Jim Crow laws in the South, which enforced racial segregation and disenfranchised Black Americans. Lynchings were common, and racial violence was a brutal reality. African Americans were largely excluded from political power and high-paying jobs, and the idea of them serving in a major war effort was met with skepticism and outright hostility by many white Americans. Meanwhile, millions of immigrants, particularly from Italy, Ireland, and Eastern Europe, had arrived in America seeking better opportunities. But they faced discrimination and were often forced into low-wage jobs in factories, mines, and construction. Gender. Roles and women's rights. Women in pre-war America were still largely confined to traditional roles as housewives and caregivers. They were expected to stay out of politics, had no right to vote, and faced limited career opportunities. Women who did work were typically confined to jobs as teachers, nurses, or factory workers, earning much lower wages than men. The suffrage movement was gaining momentum, but many people still opposed the idea of women having the right to vote. Opponents argued that women were too emotional, too delicate, or simply uninterested in politics. However, this was about to change as the war effort forced millions of women into the workforce, proving their capabilities and ultimately strengthening the push for the 19th Amendment. Class divisions and labor struggles. The divide between rich and poor was extreme. Industrial tycoons like John D. Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie had amassed enormous wealth, while millions of workers struggled to survive on low wages. Factory conditions were dangerous, with long hours, no minimum wage, and no job security. Labor unions, such as the American Federation of Labor, AFL, and the Industrial Workers of the World, IWW, were fighting for workers' rights, often facing violent crackdowns from businesses and the government. Strikes were common, as workers demanded fair wages and safer conditions, but they were frequently met with police or military intervention. These economic struggles were important because World War I would later intensify labor disputes, with workers striking over low wages despite the booming wartime economy. It would also set the stage for the Red Scare after the war, as fears of socialism and communism took hold in response to growing labor movements. A nation on the brink of change before World War I, the United States was a nation in transition, rapidly industrializing but still deeply divided by race, gender, and class. The government pursued a policy of neutrality, but the economy was increasingly tied to the European conflict. The military was small and unprepared for a large-scale war, and American society was still struggling with fundamental issues of equality and justice. All of that was about to change. As World War I dragged on, America would be forced out of its isolationist stance, mobilizing its economy, military, and people in ways never seen before. The war would disrupt American life, but it would also create opportunities for women, African Americans, and workers. The transformation would be rapid, setting the stage for America's rise as a global superpower and altering the social fabric of the nation forever. This segment sets the historical context for your video and leads seamlessly into the next section, where you can explore why and how America entered the war and the profound transformations that followed. Let me know if you'd like to tweak or expand anything. The U.S. enters the war, the road to involvement. For nearly 3 years, the United States managed to stay out of World War I, but by 1917, America was no longer just a neutral observer. It was a nation being pulled into the greatest conflict the world had ever seen. While President Woodrow Wilson had hoped to keep the U.S. out of war, a series of events forced his hand. What led America to abandon its isolationist stance and officially declare war on April 6, 1917? It wasn't a single event, but a combination of economic interests, attacks on American ships, and a shocking diplomatic revelation that made war seem inevitable. Reasons for U.S. entry into World War I. Unrestricted submarine warfare, the OI, Lusitania, and beyond. One of the biggest reasons the U.S. joined the war was Germany's unrestricted submarine warfare policy. During World War I, the British had blockaded Germany, cutting off essential supplies like food and weapons. In response, Germany used U-boats, submarines, to target British and Allied ships. The problem? These submarines often sank neutral ships, including American vessels. The most infamous attack came on May 7, 1915, when a German U-boat torpedoed the Lusitania, a British passenger ship. 198 people died, including 128 Americans. The attack sparked outrage in the U.S., but Wilson still resisted entering the war. Germany, realizing the danger of angering the U.S., promised to limit its attacks under the Sussex Pledge, 1916. However, in January 1917, Germany broke this promise, resuming unrestricted submarine warfare. This meant that any ship, including American ones, traveling in war zones could be sunk without warning. The U.S. could no longer ignore these attacks, as American trade ships were now direct targets. The Zimmermann Telegram, a shocking betrayal. While submarine warfare angered Americans, the event that truly pushed the U.S. toward war was the Zimmermann Telegram. In January 1917, British intelligence intercepted a secret message from German Foreign Minister Arthur Zimmermann to Mexico. The telegram, decoded by the British, revealed that Germany was encouraging Mexico to attack the United States. Germany promised Mexico that if it declared war on the U.S., they would help Mexico reclaim lost territories, Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico. When the British shared the telegram with the U.S. government, it caused a public uproar. Americans were furious at the idea of a foreign power conspiring against them. While some historians debate whether Mexico would have ever accepted Germany's proposal, the damage was done. The Zimmermann telegram turned American public opinion decisively in favor of war. Economic ties with the Allies. Though the U.S. remained officially neutral before 1917, economically, it was far from impartial. The U.S. had strong trade relationships with Britain and France, supplying them with weapons, food, and raw materials. American banks, particularly those led by financiers like J.P. Morgan, had loaned billions of dollars to the Allies. If the Allies lost the war, it was feared that these loans might never be repaid, leading to a financial crisis in the U.S. By contrast, trade with Germany had decreased significantly due to the British naval blockade. This meant that while the U.S. was technically neutral, its economy was already tied to an Allied victory. The longer the war dragged on, the more America's financial interests were at stake. A defeated Britain and France could default on their debts, which made it even more crucial for the U.S. to step in and ensure an Allied victory. The U.S. declares war by early April 1917. Wilson realized that neutrality was no longer an option. On April 2, 1917, he delivered a speech before Congress, stating, "The world must be made safe for democracy." On April 6, 1917, Congress officially declared war on Germany with overwhelming support. The United States had entered World War I. Now, America had to do something it had never done before: mobilize millions of men, arm them, and send them overseas to fight in a brutal, industrialized war. The Selective Service Act and the draft. When the U.S. declared war, its military was shockingly small. Unlike European nations, which had spent years preparing for war, America had no large standing army. In April 1917, the U.S. Army had only about 100,000 active duty soldiers. The National Guard could add about 115,000 more troops. Compared to the millions of soldiers fighting in Europe, this was nowhere near enough. To solve this problem, Congress passed the Selective Service Act on May 18, 1917. This law required all men between 21 and 30, later expanded to 18 to 45, to register for the draft. By the end of the war, over 2.8 million men had been drafted, and another 2 million volunteered, forming the American Expeditionary Forces AEF, led by General John J. Pershing. The draft was controversial. Some Americans resisted conscription, including pacifists and religious groups like the Quakers. Others, especially recent immigrants, felt forced to fight in a war they barely understood. Despite this, the draft filled the ranks quickly, and by 1918, the U.S. had sent over 1 million troops to Europe. Mobilization of troops and war propaganda training and preparing for war. Once drafted, soldiers needed to be trained, equipped, and transported to Europe. The U.S. government launched a massive effort to build training camps across the country, expand weapons and munitions production, organize massive transportation efforts to move soldiers across the Atlantic. This was one of the fastest military mobilizations in history, turning the U.S. into a full-scale war economy almost overnight. War propaganda and the Committee on Public Information to unite the nation behind the war. The government created the Committee on Public Information, CPI, led by George Creel. This was essentially America's first propaganda agency, and it worked aggressively to encourage patriotism and support for the war. demonized Germany, portraying them as brutal aggressors, suppressed dissent, making anti-war activists appear unpatriotic. The CPI used posters, films, speeches, and newspapers to rally public support. Famous propaganda slogans included, "Destroy," "This mad brute," depicting Germany as a monstrous guerrilla attacking the US. "Liberty bonds, buy more," encouraging Americans to help fund the war effort. "Uncle Sam wants you," one of the most iconic military recruitment posters in history. The government also passed the Espionage Act, 1917, and the Sedition Act, 1918, which made it illegal to criticize the war effort. Many people, including socialist leader Eugene V. Debs, were jailed for speaking out against the war. Conclusion: America enters a new era with troops being drafted, industry booming, and propaganda flooding the country. The United States had fully committed itself to World War I. This was more than just a war. It was a turning point in American history. The U.S. was transforming from an isolated power into a dominant global force. The economy, society, and government were shifting in ways that would have lasting effects long after the war ended. Next, we'll explore how the war changed American society, from the role of women and African Americans to the growing power of the government. Stay tuned. Economic transformation: how World War I reshaped the American economy. World War I was not just a military conflict. It was an economic revolution for the United States. The war forced America to mobilize its industries, regulate its economy, and expand its workforce like never before. This period of rapid industrial growth and government intervention laid the foundation for America's emergence as a global economic powerhouse. In this section, we'll explore how wartime production skyrocketed, how government agencies controlled the economy, and how new opportunities emerged for women and minorities. The rise of war industries and government regulation. When the U.S. entered the war in April 1917, the country faced an enormous challenge. How do you build a war machine? From scratch? Unlike the European powers, which had been producing weapons and supplies for years, the U.S. had to convert its peacetime economy into a wartime economy. Fast. To do this, the government took unprecedented control over American industries. The War Industries Board, WIB. The most important agency created during this period was the War Industries Board, WIB, established in July 1917. This agency was responsible for coordinating production, ensuring factories produced essential war goods like guns, tanks, ships, and ammunition, standardizing manufacturing. Companies were required to make products in specific designs to speed up production, e.g., making fewer types of automobile parts to simplify production. Regulating raw materials. The government controlled resources like steel, copper, and rubber, making sure they went toward the war effort rather than civilian use. Boosting efficiency. The WIB pressured industries to reduce waste and increase production speed. Key figures. The WIB was led by Bernard Baruch, a wealthy financier who helped businesses maximize efficiency while still making massive profits. Baruch famously told manufacturers, "No more 100 different kinds of steel, just a few that we can use for weapons." The result? American industry exploded with productivity, producing 4.3 million rifles, 2,500 airplanes per month by 1918, thousands of tanks, artillery pieces, and warships. Government control of the economy beyond the WIB. Other government agencies were created to regulate different aspects of the economy. The Food Administration, led by Herbert Hoover, this agency encouraged Americans to ration food and increase farm production. Slogans like "Meatless Mondays" and "Wheatless Wednesdays" were promoted to ensure soldiers had enough food overseas. The Fuel Administration managed coal and oil supplies and introduced daylight saving time to conserve energy. The Railroad Administration took control of the nation's railroads to prioritize military shipments over private business. For the first time in U.S. history, the federal government was heavily involved in regulating the economy. This shift would set a precedent for future government intervention, especially during the Great Depression and World War II. 2. Boost in production and post-war economic changes. America becomes an industrial superpower. The war supercharged the U.S. economy. In just 2 years, American factories transitioned from producing consumer goods to mass-producing war materials. By 1918, U.S. production had doubled. Industries that saw massive growth: steel and shipbuilding. American shipyards produced thousands of warships, automobiles. Factories that once made cars were now making tanks and military trucks. Chemicals and medicine. The war boosted pharmaceutical production, leading to advances in medicine. This industrial expansion didn't just fuel the war effort, it positioned the U.S. as a global economic leader in the post-war era. By 1919, America was the world's largest economy, overtaking Britain and Germany. Post-war economic boom and bust. After the war ended in November 1918, the economy initially boomed due to high demand for consumer goods. Soldiers returned home, eager to spend their wartime wages on new cars, radios, and household appliances. However, by 1920, a short recession hit as factories struggled to transition back to civilian production. The government removed its war regulations, leading to overproduction, inflation, and worker strikes. Despite this temporary downturn, the wartime economy had laid the groundwork for the 1920s economic boom, known as the Roaring Twenties. 3. The shift of women and minorities into the workforce. Women enter the workforce in large numbers. Before World War I, most women were expected to stay at home or work in low-paying jobs like teaching and domestic service. But with over 4 million men serving in the military, the U.S. faced a major labor shortage. Women stepped into roles previously reserved for men, working in factories, building tanks, airplanes, and munitions. Railroads, maintaining transportation systems, farms, taking over agricultural work to feed the troops, clerical jobs, working as secretaries, bookkeepers, and telephone operators. This wartime shift proved that women were capable of working in industries that had once been considered too demanding for them. The war and the women's suffrage movement. Women's contributions to the war effort strengthened the argument for women's voting rights. Suffragists like Alice Paul and Carrie Chapman Catt pointed out that if women could work in factories and serve as nurses, they deserved the right to vote. President Wilson, initially hesitant on suffrage, changed his stance in 1918, supporting the 19th Amendment, which granted women the right to vote in 1920. World War I directly accelerated women's rights, marking a major turning point in American history. Opportunities and challenges for African Americans. The Great Migration. The war also transformed African American employment opportunities. With white men away at war, northern factories needed workers. Over 500,000 African Americans moved from the South to northern cities like Chicago, Detroit, and New York. This movement, known as the Great Migration, reshaped American demographics and culture. Positive effects. African Americans found better jobs and higher wages than in the segregated South. Negative effects. Racial tensions increased in northern cities, leading to race riots in 1919. Despite facing discrimination, African Americans' contributions to the war effort laid the foundation for the civil rights movement decades later. Conclusion. A nation transformed. The economic transformation during World War I was one of the most significant shifts in American history. The war turned the U.S. into an industrial superpower, increased government control over the economy, opened new job opportunities for women and minorities, helped launch the Roaring Twenties, but also led to post-war tensions. World War I didn't just change the way America fought wars, it revolutionized the American economy and society. The effects of this transformation would be felt for decades, setting the stage for the Great Depression, World War II, and the Civil Rights Movement. Up next, we'll explore the social and political impact of the war, including the Red Scare, Prohibition, and the Treaty of Versailles. Stay tuned. Social changes and civil rights. How World War I reshaped American society. World War I didn't just transform America's economy, it sparked major social changes that reshaped the country for decades. As millions of men went off to war, women and African Americans took on new roles, altering the workforce and setting the stage for civil rights movements. Meanwhile, the U.S. government cracked down on free speech, testing the limits of civil liberties. In this section, we'll break down how women's wartime work fueled the fight for the 19th Amendment, the Great Migration, which reshaped America's racial demographics and laid the foundation for the civil rights movement. The Espionage and Sedition Acts, which restricted free speech and increased government control. Women's increased role in the workforce and the fight for suffrage women. Take on men's jobs before World War I. Most American women were expected to stay home or work in traditionally feminine jobs like teaching, nursing, or domestic service. But with over 4 million American men drafted into the military, the country faced a labor shortage, and women stepped up. Women started working in factories, railroads, and even heavy industry, taking on roles that were once considered too demanding for them. They worked as munitions workers, producing guns, bombs, and tanks, crucial to the war effort. Women even drove streetcars, worked in shipyards, and delivered mail, proving their capability in traditionally male-dominated fields. Women's contributions strengthened the suffrage movement. Women's wartime efforts helped convince the government that they deserved the right to vote. Before the war, the women's suffrage movement had struggled to gain national support. Groups like the National Woman's Party, NWP, led by Alice Paul, and the National American Woman Suffrage Association, NASA, led by Carrie Chapman Catt, had been campaigning for decades. At first, President Woodrow Wilson was hesitant to support women's voting rights. But as women proved their value to the war effort, the argument became undeniable. Alice Paul's argument: if women could build weapons and keep the economy running, why couldn't they vote? Carrie Chapman Catt's approach. She framed suffrage as a patriotic duty, convincing Wilson that women had earned the right to vote. The 19th Amendment, victory for women's suffrage. In 1918, President Wilson finally endorsed the 19th Amendment, calling it necessary for democracy. In 1920, the amendment was ratified, granting women the right to vote. Long-term impact. Women's role in politics expanded, leading to greater participation in the workforce and future feminist movements. The Great Migration. African Americans moved north. Why did African Americans leave the South? Before World War I, the majority of African Americans lived in the South, trapped in poverty and racial segregation due to Jim Crow laws. But when millions of white men left for war, northern industries faced a massive labor shortage. Factory. Owners in Chicago, Detroit, New York, and Pittsburgh actively recruited black workers. Black newspapers like the Chicago Defender encouraged Southern African Americans to move north for higher wages and better opportunities. The Great Migration begins between 1916 and 1920. Over 500,000 African Americans left the South for northern cities. This migration completely transformed American racial demographics. Where did they go? Chicago. The black population grew by 150%. New York, Harlem, became a major center for black culture and activism. Detroit, the auto industry hired thousands of black workers. New opportunities and new challenges, better jobs. Black workers finally had access to industrial jobs that paid more than farm labor in the South. Greater political influence. In the North, black communities could vote and organize, helping set the stage for the civil rights movement, but racism followed them north. Segregation and discrimination. Many white workers resented black competition for jobs and housing. Race riots. In 1919, violent race riots erupted in cities like Chicago, where white mobs attacked black neighborhoods. Redlining, banks and landlords enforced housing discrimination, forcing black families into overcrowded, poorly maintained neighborhoods. Despite these challenges, the Great Migration planted the seeds for the Harlem Renaissance, 1920s, and the Civil Rights Movement, 1950s-60s. The Espionage and Sedition Acts, government suppression of dissent. While the war expanded rights for women and African Americans, it also led to a crackdown on free speech and civil liberties. The Espionage Act, 1917, made it illegal to interfere with the draft or criticize the war effort. Targeted socialists, pacifists, and union leaders who opposed the war. Example: Eugene V. Debs, the leader of the Socialist Party, was sentenced to 10 years in prison for giving a speech against the draft. The Sedition Act, 1918, expanded the Espionage Act by making it a crime to criticize the U.S. government, military, or flag. People could be arrested for speaking out against the war, even in private conversations. Example: a man was jailed for 10 years just for criticizing war bonds. Impact: over 2,000 people were prosecuted under these laws. The Supreme Court upheld these restrictions in the 1919 case Schenck v. United States, ruling that speech could be limited if it created a clear and present danger. Backlash and the long-term fight for free speech. Many Americans saw these laws as violations of the First Amendment. The government's use of propaganda, through the Committee on Public Information and Censorship, fueled distrust. These events helped shape future civil rights debates, influencing later cases on freedom of speech and political dissent. Conclusion: A Nation Forever changed World War I, reshaped American society in ways that would last for decades. Women proved their value in the workforce, leading to women's suffrage and greater political rights. African Americans moved north in huge numbers, transforming urban America and fueling the fight for civil rights. The government's crackdown on free speech set a precedent for future debates about civil liberties. These changes weren't temporary. They helped define 20th century America, setting the stage for women's rights, the civil rights movement, and ongoing battles over free speech. What's next? In the next section, we'll dive into the political aftermath of WWI, including the Treaty of Versailles and America's rejection of the League of Nations, the economic shifts that led to the Roaring Twenties, and, eventually, the Great Depression, the Red Scare, and fear of communism in post-war America. Stay tuned for the next chapter of how World War I shaped modern America. Foreign policy shift. America as a global power. World War I profoundly changed America's role on the global stage. Before the war, the U.S. had largely followed an isolationist foreign policy, avoiding European conflicts. But by the war's end, the U.S. emerged as a dominant world power. Even though the country rejected the League of Nations, its influence in global affairs only grew, setting the stage for future interventions and eventually World War II. In this section, we'll explore why the U.S. rejected the League of Nations despite President Wilson's vision, how America became a global economic and military power after the war, the gradual shift from isolationism to interventionism, paving the way for World War II. 1. The League of Nations, America's rejection of Wilson's vision, Wilson's dream, a new world order. After World War I ended in 1918, President Woodrow Wilson traveled to Versailles, France to negotiate peace. His most ambitious goal? The League of Nations, an international organization designed to prevent future wars by fostering diplomacy and cooperation. Wilson's argument: the League would provide a forum for nations to resolve disputes peacefully. It would help prevent another catastrophic global war. The U.S., as the world's strongest economy, should lead the New World Order. Wilson saw the League as his legacy, believing it would ensure peace without victory and prevent future conflicts. Why did the U.S. reject the League? Despite Wilson's efforts, the U.S. never joined the League of Nations. Here's why. Congress feared loss of sovereignty. Many in the U.S. worried that joining the League would force America into future wars. The League's Article X required member nations to defend other countries, a direct challenge to America's control over its own foreign policy. Isolationist sentiment. Many Americans wanted to return to normalcy and avoid European entanglements. The war had been costly, and the idea of getting involved in another foreign conflict was deeply unpopular. Wilson's political failure. Wilson refused to compromise with Republican senators who opposed the League. He suffered a stroke in 1919, leaving him unable to effectively push the treaty through Congress. The Senate rejected the Treaty of Versailles in 1920, ensuring that America would stay out of the League. Impact of U.S. absence from the League. Without the U.S., the League lacked enforcement power. It failed to prevent rising aggression from Germany, Italy, and Japan in the 1930s. Many historians argue that U.S. participation could have strengthened the League and possibly delayed World War II. 2. America's economic and military power grows. Even though the U.S. rejected the League, it did not return to complete isolationism. In fact, America's global influence grew significantly after the war. Economic domination. The U.S. became the world's leading creditor nation. Before the war, America owed money to European nations. By 1919, Europe was deeply in debt to the US, especially Britain and France. American banks and businesses became deeply involved in global trade and finance. Rise of American industry. The war had transformed US industry, making it the world's top producer of goods. New York replaced London as the financial capital of the world. Military growth and international presence. The US built a modern navy capable of projecting power across the globe. American troops were stationed in foreign territories, particularly in Latin America. The Washington Naval Conference 1921-1922 saw the U.S. leading global arms control efforts, showing its influence in diplomacy. Even without joining the League, the U.S. couldn't completely withdraw from world affairs. The shift from isolationism to interventionism. Although America largely avoided European conflicts in the 1920s and 1930s, its policies slowly shifted toward global involvement. The interwar years. America's reluctance to engage the 1920s. The U.S. focused on domestic growth and avoided military commitments. The 1930s. The Great Depression made international affairs less of a priority. Neutrality Acts, 1935-1937. Congress passed laws banning arms sales to warring nations, reflecting strong isolationist sentiment. However, complete isolationism was impossible. By the late 1930s, tensions in Europe and Asia forced America to reconsider its stance. Path to World War II. Japan, Germany, and Italy expanded aggressively. Japan invaded China, 1937. Hitler rose to power in Germany and began violating the Treaty of Versailles. Cultural and technological shifts. After World War II introduction, the transformative power of WWI World War I wasn't just a battle fought with guns and trenches. It was a war that revolutionized technology, culture, and society itself. When the war ended in 1918, America wasn't the same nation it had been before. Key areas of transformation. 1. Medical innovations. Life-saving breakthroughs that reshaped healthcare. 2. Advancements in aviation and communication. Technologies that changed how Americans traveled and connected. 3. Cultural shifts. The rise of the lost generation, Jazz Age, and Hollywood. 4. The Red Scare. A wave of fear, paranoia, and government crackdowns on suspected communists. Let's dive deep into these changes and explore how World War I reshaped America in ways that still affect us today. Medical innovations. Advancing medicine through war. World War I introduced new types of wounds and diseases, forcing rapid medical advancements that saved lives during and after the war. Life-saving developments, X-rays, and battlefield surgery. Before WWI, X-ray technology was in its infancy. During the war, mobile X-ray units were deployed to front lines to locate bullets and shrapnel. Sterile surgical techniques improved drastically, reducing deadly infections. Blood transfusions and blood banks. Doctors developed blood storage methods leading to the first blood banks in the 1930s. These techniques revolutionized emergency medicine, saving thousands of lives in later conflicts. Mental health and PTSD awareness. Soldiers returning home suffered from shell shock, what we now call PTSD. The war sparked major discussions about mental health, leading to modern psychiatric treatments. Visual suggestion for your eye. Video. Show before and after graphics of medical advancements, e.g., early versus modern X-rays. Use real wartime footage of field hospitals to immerse viewers in the topic. 2. Aviation and communication, a new era of speed and connectivity. How? WI transformed aviation. Before WWI, airplanes were basic and unreliable. By 1918, fighter planes, bombers, and reconnaissance aircraft had been developed. Post-war impact on America. Military pilots became civilian aviators. Many WWI pilots went on to pioneer commercial aviation. The 1920s aviation boom. New airlines like Pan Am and United Airlines were founded. Charles Lindbergh's transatlantic flight, 1927, made possible by WWI aircraft technology. Visual suggestion for your video. Archive footage of early warplanes versus 1920s commercial planes. Animation showing how aviation tech evolved from WWI to passenger airlines. Radio and mass communication revolution. Before WWI, wireless radio was mainly experimental. The war fast-tracked its development, making radio a household staple by the 1920s. How radio changed America. News broadcasts. Americans could hear news in real time, revolutionizing journalism. Political messaging. Leaders like FDR used radio for mass communication, fireside chats. Music and culture spread nationwide, helped fuel the jazz age. Visual suggestion for your video. Show old radios playing historical broadcasts. Include clips of FDR's fireside chats to demonstrate radio's political power. 3. Cultural shifts. The Lost Generation, Jazz Age, and Hollywood WWI created a generation of disillusioned young people who questioned old traditions and embraced new cultural movements. The Lost Generation, a new voice in literature. WWI left many young writers disillusioned about war, government, and society. They became known as the Lost Generation, writing about themes of despair, excess, and rebellion. Famous works and writers: Ernest Hemingway, A Farewell to Arms, 1929, a tragic love story set in WWI. F. Scott Fitzgerald, The Great. Gatsby, 1925, criticized materialism and the American dream. Gertrude Stein coined the term lost generation for young people feeling lost in a post-war world. Visual suggestion for your video. Show iconic book covers and quotes from these novels. Use black and white footage of 1920s literary cafes. The Jazz Age, a musical revolution. WI's end marked the beginning of the Jazz Age, an explosion of creativity and social change. Why jazz took over America. It symbolized freedom and rebellion. African-American musicians like Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington popularized jazz. Jazz became the soundtrack of the Roaring Twenties, played in speakeasies during Prohibition. Visual suggestion for your video. Show vibrant jazz performances with clips from the 1920s. Display photos of famous Harlem Renaissance musicians. Hollywood and the birth of modern film. Hollywood became a powerhouse of entertainment in the 1920s. Key developments: silent films to talkies. The first sound film, The Jazz Singer, 1927, revolutionized movies. Movie theaters exploded in popularity. Millions flocked to see silent films starring Charlie Chaplin and Buster Keaton. Visual suggestion for your video. Show clips of 1920s Hollywood glamour and early silent films. Compare silent film clips with early sound films to highlight the innovation. 4. The Red Scare. Fear and political crackdowns. WWI didn't just bring cultural excitement. It also fueled paranoia about communism. What was the Red Scare? After the Russian Revolution, 1917, Americans feared communists would overthrow the U.S. government. Labor strikes and bombings in 1919 fueled public fear of radical movements. Government response: the Palmer Raids, 1919-1920. Thousands of Weissafs, suspected communists, arrested and deported. Civil liberties were ignored, setting a dangerous precedent for future crackdowns. Long-term impact: rise of anti-immigrant sentiment, led to strict immigration laws in the 1920s. McCarthyism, 1950s. The Second Red Scare mirrored these early fears. Visual suggestion for your video. Show historical newspapers with headlines about communism threats. Use archival footage of deportations and government crackdowns. Conclusion: how WWI shaped America's future medicine and technology advanced, laying the groundwork for modern healthcare and aviation. Culture exploded with the Jazz Age, Lost Generation, and Hollywood shaping entertainment. Political: paranoia rose, with the Red Scare setting a precedent for future government crackdowns. UI's effects still shape America today, from medicine to media to politics. Next up, how WWI led to the Great Depression and WIUS. Introduction: the war that reshaped America. World War I wasn't just a conflict fought on the battlefields of Europe. It fundamentally changed the United States in ways that still affect us today. The war's economic, social, and military impacts rippled through the Roaring Twenties, the Great Depression, the Civil Rights Movement, and even World War II. Key areas of long-term impact. 1. The economic boom of the 1920s and the Great Depression. 2. Social transformation, civil rights and gender equality. 3. military advancements, and their role in future conflicts. Let's dive deep into how WWI shaped modern America. The economic boom of the 1920s and the Great Depression. How WWI created a post-war boom. After the war, America entered an economic golden age, the Roaring Twenties. This wasn't just luck. It was directly tied to the industrial expansion caused by WWI. How did WWI create the economic boom? Mass production techniques. Factories that once made war supplies transitioned to producing consumer goods, cars, radios, household appliances. Rise of consumer culture. Wartime economic gains led to higher wages, making consumer goods more accessible. Stock market growth. Businesses boomed, and people invested heavily in stocks, expecting endless prosperity. The crash of 1929. How WWI set the stage for the Great Depression. Despite the prosperity of the 1920s, the seeds of economic disaster were planted during WWI. The hidden economic risks. Overproduction. Factories built for wartime demand kept producing at high levels, leading to oversupply. Debt and speculation. Easy credit allowed people to buy on margin, leading to an unstable stock market bubble. European debt crisis. European nations heavily indebted from the war couldn't repay American loans, causing a financial crisis. Visual ideas for your video. Show a timeline of the economy from WWI, Roaring Twenties, Great Depression. Use archival stock market crash footage to highlight the chaos of 1929. 2. Social transformation, civil rights and gender equality. World War I wasn't just about economics. It changed American society forever, paving the way for civil rights movements and gender equality. Women's rights and the 19th Amendment, 1920. Before WWI, women had long fought for the right to vote, but they were often dismissed. The war changed that. Women's war work. Women filled factory jobs left by men who went to war. They worked as nurses, clerks, and even in non-combat military roles. Their wartime contributions proved they were capable of full citizenship. Rights. Victory. The 19th Amendment. The women's suffrage movement used their wartime service as proof that they deserved the right to vote. In 1920, the 19th Amendment was passed, granting women the right to vote nationwide. Visual ideas for your video. Show photos of women working in factories and as nurses during WWI. Use footage from 1920 suffrage marches celebrating the 19th Amendment. The Great Migration and Civil Rights Movement, World War I, also triggered one of the largest migrations in U.S. history, the Great Migration. What was the Great Migration? Between 1916 and 1970, over 6 million African Americans left the South for northern cities like Chicago, Detroit, and New York. Why did they move? Wartime job opportunities. The war created new factory jobs in the North. Escape racial oppression. The South was dominated by Jim Crow laws and lynchings. Long-term impact. Civil rights movement. The migration created large Black communities in major cities, sparking cultural revolutions like the Harlem Renaissance. Increased Black political influence led to early civil rights activism. The same workforce shifts happened again in WWS, reinforcing civil rights struggles in the 1950s and 60s. Visual ideas for your video. Show historical maps of migration patterns from the South to the North. Use photographs of African Americans arriving in northern cities. Military advancements and their role in future conflicts. World War I transformed warfare forever, introducing new weapons and strategies that would later define world. War II and beyond. Weapons and tactics that shaped future wars. Tanks. First introduced in WWI, tanks became essential in modern warfare, leading to blitzkrieg tactics in WW2. Aircraft, airplanes, used mostly for reconnaissance in WWI, became key to air combat in W2 and beyond. Chemical warfare. Mustard gas was banned, but research on chemical weapons continued, influencing later conflicts. The U.S. as a military superpower before WWI, America was not a dominant military power. After WWI, things changed. Creation of a permanent military-industrial complex. The government and private industries worked closely to produce weapons. This permanent military industry would expand even more in WW2 and the Cold War. From isolationism to global interventionism, WWI planted the seeds for future U.S. involvement in world affairs. While the U.S. initially rejected the League of Nations, WW2 and the Cold War cemented its role as a global leader. Visual ideas for your video: show WWI tanks versus WW2 tanks to highlight technological evolution. Use maps to show U.S. military expansion after WWI. Conclusion: how WWI shaped America's future. The economic boom of the 1920s led to the Great Depression. Women's and civil rights movements were fueled by wartime changes. Military advancements paved the way for WW2 and future conflicts. America went from isolationism to becoming a global superpower. Final video hook. Without WWI, America wouldn't be the powerhouse it is today. But was it all for the better? What if the U.S. had stayed out of WWI? Conclusion and call to action, 28R 30R. Summarizing the key points. So let's step back and look at the big picture. World War I didn't just change America for a few years, it reshaped the entire course of the 20th century. Economic impact. The war fueled the industrial boom of the 1920s, but also planted the seeds of the Great Depression. Social transformation. Women gained the right to vote, and the Great Migration changed America's racial demographics, laying the groundwork for the civil rights movement. Military advancements, tanks, aircraft, and chemical warfare changed how wars were fought, influencing W2 and beyond. Foreign policy shift. The U.S. went from isolationism to a global superpower, setting the stage for future conflicts like W2 and the Cold War. Engaging the audience now, I want to hear from you. What do you think was the biggest impact of World War I on America? Was it the rise of women's rights, the shift toward global intervention, or something else? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Call to action. If you enjoyed this deep dive into history, make sure to like this video to help more people discover it. Subscribe for more history content just like this. Turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. Want to keep exploring? Check out our next video on how World War II built on the changes from WWI, or watch our deep dive into the Great Depression. Links are on the screen now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.